Welcome the man who is most responsible for everything we're seeing this weekend, Craig Biddle.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, good morning. So today I want to talk about the secular source and nature of rights. And this is going to tie in, I think, really nicely with a lot of what we heard yesterday. So I'll try to point out connections where I can, but I think you'll see them where you will. And it's when you see connections, make them. Make a mental note of the fact that you saw it, because that integration is what helps you to understand and really be able to retain this stuff and communicate it better. So pay attention to those notices. Don't just let them fleet away. Go, oh, that tied to that. If you say that, it helps. So I ended yesterday in my discussion talking about a framework that I think is really helpful in grasping the scientific nature of morality and ultimately politics, and why there is a science that points to the principle that the proper aim of morality is flourishing, and that the proper condition for human beings is freedom. And today I want to keep that in mind, that framework, and especially the part where I said that when we approach these subjects, morality or rights or the like, we should bear in mind the question, always bear in mind the question, do we need this thing or not? And if we do need it, then why do we need it? That why do we need it is what helps our thinking go to the right direction, toward reality, rather than toward prior conceptions of these ideas. If you just think about morality and you're like, oh, which morality should we choose? You're going to go toward one of the existing moralities. But if you instead ask the question, do we need this thing at all? And if so, why? Then you start looking at reality. That why takes you to reality. Right? So it's really important to bear that in mind. And this is going to be a big deal in the discussion of rights today. And as I mentioned yesterday, the fact that human needs are involved or human purposes are involved in these investigations or sciences has no bearing on, does not in any way degrade the scientific nature of the inquiry. Engineering is all about what needs to happen for this bridge to stand or this building to stand, right? And medicine is all about what chemicals will work for the purpose of human health, right? So the needs and purposes do not invalidate a science. And that's crucial, because you'll hear that, particularly today, the Jordan Peterson example yesterday was just the biggest example I can think of. But you're going to hear a lot of this if you start talking about this as scientific. They're like, oh, you're bringing in human purposes. That's not scientific. Yes, it is. So I want to talk about the secular source and nature of rights. And to get into that, I want to begin with some context. So as we start to think about rights, we're in a culture that already has some conceptions of rights, and it's helpful to just point those out so we know the sort of climate within which this has to be thought about and discussed. What are the traditional approaches to rights? What are the traditional theories about what rights are and where they come from? Well, there are essentially three. There's the idea that rights are God-given. They come from God, our maker. And they're moral laws. They come from God, so they're moral. That's the idea that he issues moral laws. He's the law maker of morality. And we have them because he grants them to us, and therefore people should respect our rights. And this is, so if you have a right to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, the reason that no one should violate those rights is because God said so. So that's one. Another theory that's very popular, particularly on the left, is the idea that that rights come from government, so they're government granted. And the idea here is that rights aren't really moral laws, they're political laws. So the idea is if the government says you can do something, then you have a right to do it. And if the government says you can't do it, then you don't have a right to do it. It's very simple. And the third theory is what's called natural rights. And this theory is essentially the idea that rights are inherent in human beings, given our nature. They're somehow inherent in us. We have them because we are human beings, and therefore people should respect them. Now, there are problems with each of these three, and I want to point them out briefly because the theory that we're going to look at later solves all of these problems. And if you can see that it does, then you really understand the value of it, so that it's not just this, oh, well, this is another idea. It's not just another idea. It's another idea that really goes to the core of the problem here. So what's the problem with the theory that rights come from God? So, I mean, if you want to prove that you have rights, and you say, oh, rights come from God, what do you have to prove? Well, first you have to prove that God exists, all right? Now, regardless of your religious position, regardless of whether you believe in God or not, you have to recognize the difficulty of that, right? There's no evidence for the existence of God. This is why we have the concept of faith and the concept of reason. They're different concepts. Faith is acceptance of ideas in the absence of evidence in support of those ideas. And the reason that religions make a big deal of faith is because that's how you believe in God. You can't get that belief through observation and logic. It's not there. So the first problem with the God-given rights theory is that you would have to prove that God exists. But you'd have to do more than that. Not only would you have to prove that God exists, but you would have to prove that this omnipotent creature somehow conveys rights into us. So he somehow wills us to have rights. And those rights would have to be inalienable. He can't take them away, because if he could take them away, then they're not rights, they're permissions. They're supernatural permissions. So think about, in the Bible, God kills everyone except a few people and a couple animals here and there. Did those people have rights? If their rights came from God, he obviously took them back. So there's all sorts of problems with that, and then not to mention, which God? Whose God? Do our rights come from Allah? If they come from Allah, there are many of us in here who should be beheaded, apparently. So that's not going to work. You cannot defend liberty on this idea that rights come from God. It doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not. You can't defend rights on this ground. It just can't happen. So then we'll look to government-granted rights. So this is very popular on the left. Cass Sunstein writes about this and others. And the idea is that there's no such thing as rights, you guys. The rights come from government. Government tells you what you can do. Those are your rights. And if it says you can't do it, then you can't do it. And that's your right. What's the problem here? This is a complete bastardization of the concept of rights. The whole point of the purpose of the concept of rights, the reason we need this idea, is to distinguish between what the government says we can do and a moral fact, a moral principle that comes before government. The founders recognized this. They said that governments are established to protect rights. Rights are pre-existing government. Rights are moral principles that exist prior to government. The purpose of a government is to protect those rights. The governments don't create rights. And you can see this very clearly because we already have a concept for the thing they're talking about. What would that be? Law. If the government says you can do it or you can't do it, that's called a law. We don't need to replace that concept with the concept of rights. We already have a concept there. It's called law. It's very simple. And this is just totally disingenuous of the people who say this too, because this is not this might be new if you haven't thought a lot about this, but if your profession is to think about rights and law, and you haven't come to this, they should know this. Cass Sunstein and company should know that rights and law are different things, and they're at different places in the conceptual hierarchy. So rights are precisely supposed to be, whether they exist or not, we haven't even determined whether they exist, but the purpose of the concept is to identify this thing that may exist or may not, but that we have a moral prerogative to act in a certain way, regardless of what government says. That's the purpose of the concept. So the government-granted idea is just a violation of epistemology, really. And then we get to the one that sounds the most interesting, probably, to people in this room, especially if you haven't heard the theory that I'm going to be talking about as we move on, and that is that rights are natural, that they're inherent in man's nature somehow. Now, this sounds really good, and if it were true, it would be, and if we could point to the facts, then it would be helpful, I guess, in a certain regard. If you could cut me open and you go, well, the rights are right here, they're underneath the heart, or whatever. Like if you could have evidence that they're inherent in me, that would be something. But here's the thing: you can't. Rights are not inherent in us in any way like that. They're not physical things, and they're not in our brain. They're not anywhere in here. So, and then there's another problem with natural rights theory, and that is that historically, natural rights theory is not really natural rights theory. It's supernatural rights theory. And we can see this if you look at the works of the major thinkers in rights history. John Locke, well, the founders who got their idea, who learned about rights from John Locke. And there's a lot of good thinking in Locke, including his thinking about rights, particularly his thinking about property rights. But where does Locke ultimately anchor this idea? He says that rights come from a moral law. And where does that moral law come from? It comes from our Maker. He says that we are God's property because he created us. And therefore, man has no right to do something with me. I belong to God. I'm God's property. That's the anchoring of Locke's basis for rights. Even the thinkers before Locke, Samuel Pufendorf and Hugo Grotius. Hugo Grotius was a 17th century Dutch jurist. And he had some really good things to say. And one of the things he said is that even if we were to accept the idea that the wicked idea that we must not accept that there is no God, natural law would still have some validity. That sounds good. But the problem is he never pointed to what the natural law is. He never specified what the natural law is. He never elaborated it. He never pointed to the facts of reality that give rise to it. He never said why we have it and how we know. And if you don't know why we have rights and how we know, then you don't know why we have rights and how we know. So the idea of natural rights is not going to help us ultimately. It sounds better than the other theories, and it served to some extent. It served to help launch the United States. I mean, some of these things, when people get partial ideas or get ideas partially right in history, very often they can do a lot with that. So, but after the founders established our country, they didn't see utilitarianism coming along. They didn't see egalitarianism coming along. They didn't see these other philosophies that were coming down the pike that were going to make hash of this idea that rights are either self-evident. No, they're not. Look around. You can't see them. You can't hear them. You can't taste them. They're not self-evident. And they're not natural in the sense that we can point to facts in reality. They're natural in a sense, which I'm going to get to, but they're not natural in the way that they thought about them, because you can't point to the moral law that they thought rights came from. It ultimately ends up you're talking about supernatural law, not natural law. So now there's a real problem here, because if we can't defend rights, then the utilitarians are correct. Rights are nonsense upon stilts, says Jeremy Bentham. Nonsense upon stilts. I mentioned yesterday, Alistair MacIntyre, a philosopher, says that rights are imprescriptible rights, inalienable rights, the kind of rights that the founders talked about, are one with witches and unicorns. Why? Because there's precisely the same amount of evidence in support of their existence. So the reason that rights are being so trampled today is because so few people understand what they are and where they come from, why we have them. So this is a really important topic. And not everybody in the world has to know this for things to change. Not everybody in the world understood the extent that the founders understood, and they were able to make massive change. So we don't have to teach this to everyone, but we have to understand it ourselves if we want to win this battle, and we have to be able to communicate these ideas to other people so that they understand it well enough to help move things forward. So I want to dive into how Ayn Rand approached this, and I'm going to give you the nuts and bolts of it. Obviously, I can't do the whole theory in a single lecture. I wrote an article titled Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights, and I recommend reading that if you have time and are interested in this, because it's pretty thorough for a brief article. So that may help if you're interested. So Rand approaches rights by, first off, noting that they're moral principles, right? This is the idea that they're not political. They come prior to government. This is the same idea that the founders noted. The reason we need this concept is because there's something before government. They're moral principles. And we can see this when we just say that rights are about what people should be free to do. If we put the emphasis on free, we can see they're a political thing. But if we put the emphasis on should, we can see we're talking about moral concepts. This is a moral concept. So we're in morality here when we're talking about rights. That's where we are. And they're essentially, rights, as we'll see, they're a bridge from politics to ethics. They have a foot in both. The free part is in politics, and the should part is in ethics. So the way that Rand looked at this is she said, she didn't say this, but this was the attitude. Let's get scientific about this. We're talking about rights, and we're talking about man and whether he has them. And we want to look at the facts of reality. Well, we have to be very clear on what man is then. What is this thing we're claiming has this other thing? If we don't know what man is, we're not going to be able to talk about what characteristics or qualities he has or what things apply to him. So it's very important to get clear on what human nature is. And Rand points out in multiple ways and from many, many angles that the essence of man is reason. It's our rational faculty. We survive by using reason, by observing reality, integrating our observations into concepts and generalizations and principles, and then acting on our rational judgment. That's how we live. This is why, when kids are being taught how to cross a street, you say, well, okay, Johnny, when the light turns, red, you stop here, and you're talking to your child, you're giving him reason. This is why he stays alive. And then he learns to use all of that to grow up and think rationally. And to the extent that he's rational, he lives. And to the extent that he isn't, well, you've heard of the Darwin Awards, right? So, but then we can look in history too. How have all the things that we enjoy and that support our lives, where did they all come from? Where did agricultural principles come from? Where did the principles of engineering and physics and medicine and all? They came from people using reason. Observing reality, integrating their ideas, coming up with these things. So the reason is our means of living. It's our basic means of living, and that's because it's our means of knowledge. It's how we know the world. It's how we know what's true. So that's the essence of man. We live by acting on our rational judgment. So the big question regarding rights is, what can stop us from acting on our judgment? This animal lives this way, so what can stop him from acting on his judgment? And I want to get crystal clear on this, because this is the linchpin on the rights issue. So I want to look at several examples, and then we'll draw from the examples. We'll be scientific here. We're going to look at reality, and we'll draw from reality a principle and see where that goes. So I want to clear the slate and make it really simple to begin with. So we'll go to a desert island. Suppose I'm on a desert island, and no one's there, and I wake up in the morning and I decide I'm going to build a new shelter today. That cave I've been living in is getting musty. I'm going to build a shelter over here, and so I start building it. Am I free to build the shelter? Well, yeah, There's no one's there to stop me. I can just do it. I don't need a permit. I don't need any. I can build a second story on the shelter and a shed behind it. I don't need anything. So I'm free to build the shelter. I'm free to try to fashion a trap to catch a squirrel or to make a hook out of a bone or something and try to catch a fish. I'm free to act on my judgment. There's no one there to stop me. I'm completely free. But let's say some brute rose up on the island, big, hairy guy, and he gets off, and I'm like, oh, I hope this guy's going to be helpful. And nope, he grabs me and he lashes me to a tree with a vine. Now I'm lashed to a tree, and this is just a sadistic brute. And he leaves me there. Now, I had planned that afternoon to do some fishing. Can I act on my judgment? Obviously not. Suppose, now I'm probably going to die pretty soon here, right, if he doesn't feed me. But let's say he keeps feeding me and he leaves me strapped to the tree and he keeps me alive for weeks on end. I'm just strapped to the tree. I'm getting burned and fly bitten and everything. I'm alive, but am I living a human life? No, because a human life is precisely a life guided by the judgment of one's mind. We know this at least viscerally. This is why slavery is wrong. Today, we know this, that a human living a human life means using your rational faculty to pursue the values that support your life. That's what it means. So this is not a human life. The mere fact that I'm alive and breathing and that my heart is beating does not mean that I'm living, at least not as a human being. Okay, so we can see here. No, I want to give one other example with him. So let's say he unstraps me, and now I'm free. I'm sort of feeble now, but I'm free to roam the island. But he says, anything you catch or create or build is mine. You have to give it to me, or I'll strap you back to the tree. Am I free now? Well, no, I'm still not free. I'm a slave, basically, at this point. And so force comes in degrees. I have a degree of freedom here, but the fact is that I'm still completely coerced in another respect. So when you're tied to the tree, it's absolute force, as if you're in a concentration camp or the like, right? And if you're freed out into the world, but you're restricted by somebody to a large extent, then you're still subject to force. You're still not living a human life. So force comes in degrees. And we can see that right there. All right, let's come back to civilization. Suppose I'm walking to the store and I've got my wallet in my pocket, and my goal is to go grocery shopping. So in California, you have to carry your bag with you because they won't give you bags anymore. So I got my bag also, but that's not really important. I've got my wallet. I'm going to the store, and a thug jumps out from an alley, and he puts a gun to my head. He says, "Give me your wallet." Now, am I free to act on my judgment? Obviously not. My judgment was to go to the store and use this money to buy groceries. So I give him, and I'm not free. My alternatives are to get shot in the head, or say, well, it's to get shot in the head or to give him the wallet, and then I can't act on my judgment. That's the point there. Now, I give him my wallet because I'm not stupid, and he runs away. Now, am I free to act on my judgment? Nope. My judgment was to use that money to go to the store and buy groceries, and I can't use that money anymore because it's gone. He took it. So force actually can linger in the sense that this points to the issue of property rights, right? If you can't use your property, then you can't act on your judgment. I can't use that. I could go get other money, but I can't use that money, and my judgment was to use that money. So there's another instance of force that shows that force comes in kinds and degrees, and it can be direct or indirect. When he's gone, the force is indirect. He's no longer there, but I still can't use the money. So let's go to Afghanistan. So a woman in Afghanistan wants to open a booth out on the street selling bikinis. Okay. We'll make it more realistic. She wants to sell headscarves. So she makes these headscarves that she loves, and she wants to sell them on the street. But the Taliban man comes up and says, "You can't sell headscarves. You can't do business. You're a woman." Allah says, "You cannot do this. Go home, or we'll have to lock you up in a cage or worse." And also, put your headscarf back on and go home, right? So they send her home. Can this woman act on her judgment? Well, obviously not. I'll leave that example there because it's clear enough. All right. We'll come back to civilization. Suppose I want to buy a used car. And so I do my research, and I find a Volvo, and it looks pretty good. Guy's asking $10,000 for it. He says it's got 100,000 miles on it. And so, I kick the tires, and I take it for a ride, and the odometer says 100,000 miles. And I come back, and I say, I'll take it. So I give him 10,000, what did I say, 10,000, 100,000? Yeah, $10,000, 100,000 miles. I give him the car, and I drive away. But unbeknownst to me, he had set the odometer back. The car actually has 150,000 miles on it. Am I driving the car that I bargained for? No. I'm not acting on my judgment. My judgment was to get a car that had 100,000 miles on it. But here I am driving one with 150, and I don't even know that. But I'm still not acting on my judgment, because my judgment tells me that I'm driving a car with 100,000 miles on it. So I'm acting on something else. This is called fraud. This is how fraud works. If somebody acquires a value from you under false pretense and gives you a value that is not what it was supposed to be, that was not the one you agreed on, he has committed force, and the force remains even if you don't know it. You don't have to know it, it's still there. So force comes in kinds and degrees. It can be direct and it can be indirect. So it's a fairly complex idea, even though at the first level it's very straightforward. The punch in the face is force, but then there are some other elements. But the fact is, and what we can see through these examples, is that in all cases, force used against a human being stops him from acting on the judgment of his mind, on his rational judgment, his means of living. Force retards human life. Force used against a human being retards his life in some way and to some degree, always. There are no exceptions. If you can't act on your judgment in a certain respect, then you cannot act on your judgment. You can't act on your means of living. Your life is retarded. And this applies to the bigger, more complex issues. Should insurance companies should be able to sell insurance over state lines? Let's say Betsy owns an insurance company, and she lives in California, and I live in Nevada, and I'd love to buy an insurance policy from you. And so we go to trade, and a bureaucrat jumps in and says, no, you can't do that. There's a law that says you can't do that. We can't act on our judgment. With booksellers in a certain way, and the government tells them that they can't do it, then Amazon cannot act on their judgment, nor can the booksellers. So just because an application of force doesn't kill someone doesn't mean it's not throttling his life. It is. So this is what's going on. This is the thing that can stop us from acting on our judgment. Physical force or fraud or extortion or the various kinds of indirect force. And so we need a principle. We need a principle to protect us from force. And the fact that we need the principle does not in any way invalidate the scientific nature of this inquiry. Just bear the other sciences in mind that are based on needs. So we need a principle. As they say, there ought to be a law. Well, in this case, there really ought to be, but it's a principle. It's not a law. And the principle is this. Principles are recognitions of facts. That's what a principle is in the broadest sense of the term. And the facts that are being recognized with the principle of rights are this. So the principle of individual rights I would define this way. It's recognition of the fact that in order to live as a human being, a person must be free to act on his judgment. Therefore, he must be left free to act on his judgment. No one has a right to, no one has a moral prerogative to stop him from acting on his judgment. Unless he's violating somebody else's rights. If you contradict the very principle that we're talking about, you remove yourself from the application of the principle, to some extent at least. So the principle of individual rights is the recognition of the fact that in order to live as a human being must act on his or her judgment, and therefore, he must be left free to act on his judgment. And this is the basic idea. And Rand defined a right as a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. And I think that's a good definition. I like her definition, but I like mine a little bit better because it points to the recognition of the thing. It brings in the recognition of the fact that we're looking at and the reason why that fact gives rise to this principle. But different definitions serve different purposes in different contexts. So I don't know that mine is better in all contexts, but it's better for the purpose of this discussion here. So that's what a right is. And what it means is that we really have these things. This is a scientific fact. It's a fact. We can see it. We just looked at the examples. We just looked at reality. You can see that to the extent that physical force is used against the person, he can't act on his judgment. He can't live fully as a human being. A human life is a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind. And the way we got here is through Rand's brilliant approach to these kinds of issues, by asking the question, what is this thing, and do we need it, and if so, why? This is the brilliance of her approach to morality and rights. She takes this very same approach, incidentally, in epistemology. It's not as evident there in some cases, but it's there, and it's basically the same thing. It's always, what is this thing? Do we need it? If so, why? And the why takes her down to where the facts are. And it's all scientific. And if we understand this, if we get this, if we come to own these ideas and also come to be able to communicate them clearly to others, and you don't have to be able to communicate them pristinely in every that's not the point. The point is, can you point to the essential facts and just use your own words and say, well, look, if you come up with your own examples. If I put a gun to your head and, can you do this? Or if I hold you down with my foot, and a big guy's holding you down, what can you do? And this goes to a question that was asked yesterday about somebody who said, what about the people who try to define force by saying that a hungry man is not free, or a man in need is not free, or the like. And you have to engage with people who are willing to talk about terms, definitions, and concepts and the like by saying, well, what makes sense given the need, given our conceptual needs? The purpose of concepts is to categorize things in reality, facts in reality, so that we can think clearly and communicate clearly using them. And so there's a whole science to doing that correctly. And but just on the basic sort of simple level on that, when somebody says, well, I think a hungry man is not free, if you just say, well, what does that mean? If we use the concept of freedom that way, then it kind of loses all of its meaning in all of these other areas. So, but if you get this idea, I think you'll see that we have a scientific foundation for what rights are, where they come from, and how we know it. And this solves all of the problems that the other theories of rights are mired with, right? They're not coming from some supernatural thing. They're coming right from here in reality, from observation and logic. We don't have to worry about different gods and other gods and whose God said what. All of that goes, you can understand this theory and still keep a belief in God even. And my recommendation to people who are insistent about maintaining a belief in God is fine, but if you want to defend rights and freedom, you got to admit that a theory of rights that's based on evidence and logic that you can see is true is much stronger than one that says, well, you have to have faith. It's just a whole lot stronger. So even for people who still believe in God, I think you really need to see and embrace the difference here. This is a difference that makes a huge difference. Evidence-based, logical understanding, scientific fact versus religious faith. It's a big difference. As for the The government-granted rights theory, it's equally powerful, right? People say, well, rights come from government, and you can say that's ridiculous. Rights don't come from government, but government issues laws. Rights come from here. They come from the fact that human beings survive by means of reason, that to the extent force is used against human beings, they cannot act on their rational judgment. Therefore, we need a principle, and that principle is the recognition of these facts. It's the recognition of the fact that we have to act on our judgment to live. Therefore, we must be free to act on our judgment in order to live. So there's a whole lot more to this. I'm trying to give you a quick snapshot and sort of a framework to think about this. And so I recommend read Ayn Rand's essays, Man's Rights and the Nature of Government. Take a look at my essay titled Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights, which I think it sort of takes what I've talked about today and elaborates it and gives a bunch more examples and concretes. And think about it and try talking to people in these terms, or in your own terms, but with these ideas, and you'll see that we have a revolutionary idea here. This is a game changer. Look, when the founders just came up with the idea that all men have rights because either because they're self-evident or because they come from our Creator. That wasn't even true, and they were able to do a fair amount of good with it. We have the truth here on this. We have the factual foundation for this idea. We can see that this is all scientific. And then we get to the third theory, the natural rights. And I have friends who insist that natural rights is still a good way to talk about Rand's theory, and I disagree. But I don't think huge things hang on this. The problem with natural rights theory, natural rights would have been a fine term for Ayn Rand's theory if it hadn't already been co-opted by the supernatural rights theorists for hundreds of years. So it's like libertarianism might have been a good name for Rand's politics if it hadn't been seized by people who were disinterested in trying to defend it with moral and philosophic principles. So the way I look at Rand's theory is it's not a natural rights theory, it's an objective rights theory. And here's the final thing I want to say about this. This is the best way to conceptualize that. Ayn Rand made a distinction between what she called subjectivism and intrinsicism. Right? Subjectivism is a term you've probably heard, so we'll start there because it's kind of easy. So the idea of subjective, something being subjective, it's just in your head. It's just your thoughts, your feelings. It's something internally. It has to do with your ideas. That's the subjective element. And intrinsicism is the idea that something is out there. It's outside of us, and it exists out there in nature. Now, there are things that are intrinsic in nature. A tiger is intrinsic in nature. It's out there. But rights are not out there, which is why we can go looking for them and we're not going to find them. You can look under behind a tree, under a rock, up in the stars, wherever. You're not going to find them. They're not out there, nor are they in here. They're not inherent in us. So they're not intrinsic and they're not inherent. If they were inherent, we'd be able to point them out. What they are is a third thing. So they're not subjective and they're not intrinsic. They're objective. What does objective mean? Objective is a unification of the out there and the in here. It's a recognition, that's the in here part, of a fact of reality. That's the out there part. It's a recognition of a fact. What fact are we recognizing? We're recognizing the fact that human beings survive by means of reason, by acting on their rational judgment, and therefore, in order to live as a human being, they must be free to act on their judgment. That's what we're recognizing, and those are facts. Objectivity is the recognition of facts. That's at least in this context, that's what it means. So there's subjective theory of rights. They come from government says so. That's all internal. Intrinsic theory of rights, that's the better aspect of or not even the better aspect, but both aspects of, so the religious, they're from God, he's out there, or they're from nature out there or in here. The natural rights kind of has a foot in both places because sometimes they're talking about intrinsic and sometimes they're talking about extrinsic or subjective. God said so. But the fact is that rights are objective. the recognitions of facts. And so this is scientific. We have a science that shows us that rights are real, that we have them, and although it took a genius and several geniuses behind her on whose shoulders she stood on this, I mean, Rand had a whole lot of respect for Locke on these issues and others. I mean, she didn't just pull this thing out of whole cloth. But what she did is she figured out the fact. We talked yesterday about what does it mean to understand something or for something to make sense. She figured out those steps underneath it that anchor this stuff to reality, to perceptual reality. That's the difference. And now that we have that, this is a game changer. This is revolutionary. The founders did a lot with an ill-conceived theory of rights. We have what I think, you'll have to look into it yourself further, but I think it's a perfectly conceived theory of rights. And if that's so, how much stronger will the liberty movement be if more and more people in the movement who are active in talking about this understand this? Not only can they explain the idea better, but what's the difference in your moral certitude, in the chutzpah, you can bring to the fight? I wrote a brief article the other day called The Passion of Socialists. And it was precisely to sort of contrast with the idea of the passion of Christ. And in there, I point out that I start it with, and I think the girl is here who asked me this question. I was at a fee conference recently, and one of the students there asked me, why is it that the socialists have so much passion behind their fight, and the capitalists don't seem to have it? And the reason is that the socialists have traditional morality on their side. If you should sacrifice for others, if that's what being moral consists of, then a government that ensures that people are going to do that sounds like a pretty good government, right? And unfortunately, the idea that we should sacrifice comes from multiple places in the society. I point out in the article that a lot of it comes from the Bible. So you get, in the Old Testament, God says through Moses, be open-handed to the poor and needy in your land, et cetera, et cetera. So, you're supposed to sacrifice for people there. In the New Testament, obviously, Jesus says, sell all that you have. If you want to be a disciple of mine, sell all that you have and give it to the poor, et cetera, sacrifice. And we saw other sacrifices yesterday. So if that's all true, then obviously socialism is right. And so they do have the passion behind them. But here's the thing, they don't have the facts behind them. We have the facts. And so if we embrace the facts, if we understand the facts, then we win. I mentioned in that same article that, what the utilitarians say about this, what the egalitarians say about this. All of them have a theory on this stuff, on what rights are, where they come from, and then what political system we should have. But none of them have the facts. We have all of that. The problem is most people in the liberty movement don't know it. So it's really an issue of education. We've got to help more people to see just the way in which this stuff comes together and the facts that give rise to and support these ideas. So I'm going to leave it there for today, and I think we have plenty of time for questions. How much time is left? Oh, I can look. Thank you.
Hey. So going back to the guy on the desert island, I was wondering about an alternative scenario where instead of the brute, say a leopard shows up, and so you have to huddle back in your shelter so that it doesn't eat you. You can't go fishing the way that you'd originally planned and so on. That doesn't seem like a rights violation. What's the difference?
Very good question. Thank you. So he asks, you're on the island, you're in your shelter, and a lion comes along, and you wanted to go out, but you can't because there's a lion out there, or whatever. And if you go out, you're going to get eaten. So you can't act on your judgment. What's the difference? Yeah. So when we're inquiring in our minds about rights, we're already in a context. When we're saying what should people be free to do and not free to do, we're already in a context where the context is in a social environment. We're talking about with other people. Obviously, if if you're in Africa and an elephant puts his foot down on you, and holds you down, you can't move. You're probably going to die too, but you can't go anywhere. And if a tiger is standing outside your cave, you can't act on your judgment in that respect. If lightning strikes you and you die, you can't act on your judgment today. There are all of these things that happen that are natural, not man-made events, can, in a sense, stop you from acting on your judgment. So in that sense, physical force from human beings is not the only thing that can stop you from acting on your judgment, but it does stop you from acting on your judgment. So it doesn't matter that it's not the only thing. It does stop you from acting on your judgment. Pardon?
You're going to change your judgment that there's a tiger out there, and so you're using your reason.
Yeah, okay, this is another way, very good point too. So Doug says, well, actually, you're still acting on your judgment because there's a tiger out there, and your judgment is now, I'm not going out there because there's a tiger out there. Yes, but people sometimes will retort. I've been in many of these conversations. They'll say, well, that's the same thing when somebody puts a gun to your head. You now say, well, my judgment is that I'm not going to. So I think the cleaner distinction here, 'cause that's a good point, but the cleaner distinction here is simply that, and the more contextually accurate distinction is simply that we're asking about what should people be free to do, and that's the question we're talking about with rights. We're looking at a social context. So I think that's the...
Okay, the question was asked already. I think that you define judgment as a static value. You judge that you want to buy, but when your valet was taken from you, your judgment has to change. So judgment has to be dynamic. And to extend it, government is there, it's a fact. You have to act according to this fact. You cannot ignore government, and you cannot ignore tyranny or any other thing.
Yes, that's true. Do you have a question about that? Or
I'm questioning the whole idea of using judgment as the basis of your theory.
Oh, okay, good, got it. So given the fact that you can't ignore the fact that government's there, and you have to take that into your, so for instance, we have to pay taxes today, whether we want to or not, because if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to get thrown in jail. So I have to use my judgment there, and I can't ignore those facts. That's true, but it has no bearing on where rights come from. Here are the facts that remain that are key and pivotal. We survive by means of our judgment. To the extent that government or other people use force against us, we can't act on our judgment, and therefore, to the extent they use force against us, we can't live fully as human beings. So this is why we have the moral prerogative to say to governments, you may not do anything except protect us from initiatory force. Now, this talk isn't about government. This is pre-government. We're talking about where rights come from and how we know it. I give talks sometimes on the nature of government and what a government should do and shouldn't do and why, and even how you fund a government and all of that. But I'm not saying that we should ignore the existence of government or force. I'm saying that we have a moral prerogative to say to force initiators that you may not do that. Even to, well, let me finish to answer your question. So even to people, first of all, rights theory is complex and difficult, and not everybody's going to go there. Not everybody's going to think about it. And so some people might say, well, I'm going to violate your rights, and I don't care what your highfalutin ideas are. I'm just going to come in and take your stuff, right? And so he can do that. He may not do it, right? If we get into moral terms, he has no moral prerogative to do that, but he can do it in the sense that he can come in with a gun and put it to, it happens all the time. So there's can and ought. Somebody might be able to do something, but he can't do it morally. And that's the difference that we're talking about here. And if other people don't understand rights theory or buy into it, or when other people violate our rights, we don't need their buy-in to say to them, that's immoral, you can't do that, and if you do it or try it, then we can have you arrested, tried, and thrown in jail, or punished in whatever way proportionally makes sense given what happened. So you criminals, I mean, this isn't just theory. We can look out. The criminals do this all the time. They take people's stuff, and we go, well, actually, you can't do that. And they might be going, well, I want to do that. And we're like, it doesn't matter what you want to do. You can't. But can't in the sense that we have legitimate laws against it. So if I didn't answer your question, we can talk more later.
Hi. So this whole concept of rights, I think, is true and reducible to facts and life as the standard of value, but it's really abstract, as you just mentioned. And when talking to friends and family and coworkers who have not followed this abstract chain of logic and observing facts, what are strategies for like when and how to deploy this concept of rights? It's like, oh, you think that all the CEOs should be thrown in jail? I think that's wrong because they have individual rights. But then do you just have to take a step back and prove rights in that conversation?
Yeah, a very good question. I'm glad you asked that. Because, yeah, I'm not saying that every time a question comes up about this, you have to give the whole theory that proves rights. The reason I think it's important for us to understand the whole proof is because it gives us moral certitude and it enables us to be flexible and dynamic in conversations. If you understand the whole thing, then you get into a conversation with somebody and his pressure point is on one area. You know how to master that area. You know how to talk about that. So if somebody says, well, look, I think that these corporations are ripping everybody off and they should all be thrown in jail, then you want to ask them, well, what do you mean by ripping people off? You want to ask them, where are they forcing people to do something? You would want to make the distinction, and Harry Binswanger has a wonderful article on this called The Dollar versus the Gun. You want to make the distinction between economic power and political power, or the power of the dollar versus the power of the gun. Are the corporations putting a gun to anyone's head? And they'll say, well, no, but they're doing this other thing. And you'll have to have the conversation. I mean, there's no silver bullet for any of this. People have a lot of confusions in their mind about this stuff. And when you're talking to people, you have to deal with that confusion. But you can't do that if you don't understand the ideas pretty well. You don't have to understand them like a professional philosopher understands them who puts his whole time and life into this, right? But in order to have fluid conversations and to be able to converse well, the better you understand this, the better you can do that. So to answer your question more directly, take the context. It's very contextual. And definitely do not try to prove the theory of rights at every point. But I'll tell you this is an interesting way to think about it, though. If you have time and if somebody's really active-minded and you can get them to see that what we're talking here is a matter of what do people have a right to do and what do they not have a right to do. And you can say, are you willing to talk about that and how we know whether this is true? And if they are, then here's a really good in to a discussion on this is to point out the three traditional theories and the problems with them. God-given, government-granted, and natural, we have them, but we know not how, really, right? The idea that they're kind of inherent, but we can't say how, or nobody really knows how, but ultimately that's supernatural. And if you can get those on the table and point out the problems, and then say, but what if we think about this differently? What if we think about rights not in terms of other people telling us what we can do, but instead what we need to do in order to live? Well, we live by acting on our judgment. And you can give some examples on that, and then say, and you can see that if somebody stops us from acting on our judgment, then we can't live. So we need rights so that we can live. And nobody's going to be moved by a short discussion on this completely. But the question is, can you point them in the direction? Can you get them interested enough to read Ayn Rand's essay, Man's Rights? Because if you can get them to do that, you're gonna make some headway. I have never, and I'm pretty good at talking about this stuff, I have never just sat down with somebody in a short conversation and converted them completely to this theory of rights in a sitting. You can't do that. And if somebody did say, oh, now I get it, I'm 100% on board with you, it would be disingenuous. Like it wouldn't even be the case. Because integration requires not only putting the things together that belong together, it requires busting up the things you thought belong together that don't. You have to do both things to actually grasp the ideas. So be patient with people when you're talking to them. I would say don't talk to people if you think they're not honest, if they're not really interested in the truth. I'd just get out and find something else to do, or talk to them about something that doesn't involve this, morality and rights. But if somebody's active-minded, just kind of judge it based on their interests, their context, and how much time you have.
All right, thanks. And I also really enjoyed your essay, Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights. I've studied it many times, so thank you.
I appreciate that.
Hi, Craig. I hear human rights a lot, plural rights. which makes me think that there's a list somewhere of rights.
Yeah, there is.
I have a right to go to the grocery store. I have a right to bank here. And that can get cumbersome if there's this idea that there's a list.
Yeah.
You said something earlier about a freedom to act, which seems to me to encompass. So I get confused sometimes when I hear this, what sounds like a list somewhere.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So, and I probably should have woven this into the talk, but we'll do it now. So there's a distinction, frequently rights theorists talk about a distinction between positive and negative rights. And the idea is that positive rights are that you have a right to some good or some service out there. And negative rights mean you have a right to be free from force. And using that terminology, which I don't typically use, but I can respect why people do, legitimate rights are only negative rights. But the reason I don't like that term is because I don't like the word negative being attached to something so positive. So I'm not a fan of it. But just to make the distinction here, you cannot have a right to a good or service for the fairly obvious reason that if you have a right to a good or service, that person's going to have to be, whoever produces that good or service is going to have to be forced to give you that thing. So it's just a direct contradiction to the very idea of rights. So I think the best thing to do in that kind, when like the United Nations has a list of rights, and there are several other lists of rights, and when people have these lists, you have to make this distinction early on and say, look, you can't have a right to a good or service because that implies force on somebody else. Rights are about freedom to act. They're all verbs. Think about it this way. So what is the right to life? It's the right to take all of the actions necessary to sustain and further your life. The verb, to take all of the actions. That's right, there's the verb. What's the right to liberty? The right to liberty is the right to act on your judgment free of coercion from other people or governments. It's the right to act on your judgment. The right to liberty and the right to life are very similar. In fact, they're the same right looked at from two different angles. What's the right to property? It's the right to produce and to keep and use the product of your effort. So it's the right to keep and use the product of your effort. To keep and use, those are verbs. These are all actions. The right to property is not the right to be given property. And this is the most obvious example. This ties into Tim's discussion yesterday Tim Sandefur's discussion when he was talking about the bastardization of Frederick Douglass's claim to be a self-made man, because they equivocate. It's like, obviously, he didn't mean that nobody ever helped him in life, right? What he means is that he succeeded by means of his own choices and actions, and you have to make that distinction. And the same is true when we're talking about rights. So, just lost my train of thought on that. We're talking about, the question here is positive and negative rights. There we go. So, yeah, at property, at the right to keep and use the product of your effort, if somebody comes around and says, well, the right to property means you have a right to a house or a car or health care, those are properties, right? No, that is not what the right to property means, and it's a really juvenile way for any thoughtful adult to think about it. So when people bring that up, they're trying to get away with something. No, what the right to property is the right to keep and use the product of your effort, or the things that you've traded for, the things that are rightfully yours. And lastly, the right to the pursuit of happiness. What is that? It's the right to pursue the goals and values of your choosing. Pursue is the verb. So all of these are actions, and you cannot have a right to a good or service because it implies a violation of the rights of someone else. That's what I would think of that.
I think you touched on this a little bit. We always, when we talk about rights, we're talking about, it's usually you start by talking about the rights of the individual and how to protect them from force from someone else. But if we flip the story and go back to the desert island, someone else is on the desert island and you row up and you have a gun. Could you elaborate on why it's important to respect the rights of others?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. So why respect, what necessitates the respect for the rights of others? There are two things, and they're related, self-interest and consistency. So it's in your self-interest to respect the rights of others because others are producers and traders. They're purveyors of values. And so you can, if you don't force people to act against their judgment, then they can use their judgment to make things. And if they make things, whether they're material values like iPhones and airplanes and medicines, or whether they're spiritual values like romantic love. So, I mean, if you beat your wife, you're using force against her, but this isn't good for your love life. So it's both spiritual and material values that play here. And the fact is, it's not good for you to violate the rights of others. And the fact that some subjectivists will say, oh, I don't care about your goods, I'm going to do it anyway. We can't change that. There are people who are just going to, they're anti-conceptual people. And we can't do anything about that. The only thing we can do is say, you guys can be as anti-conceptual as you want, but if you use force against people, we're going to arrest you and put you in jail or whatever. And we have a moral prerogative to do that regardless of what they think. So the other point on respecting people's rights is it's a matter of moral consistency. You cannot claim protection from a principle that you violate. All right? Now, it gets tricky with rights because if a child steals a pack of gum from a 7-Eleven, he's committed an act of force. Does the child lose all of his rights? No. Even if an adult steals a pack of gum from a 7-Eleven, has he lost all of his rights? No. There are degrees of rights violations, and there needs to be, and should be, and are, in proper law, degrees of punishment consonant with the rights violation in question. So it's and this is complex. Now we're getting into philosophy of law, but your question was really just about what necessitates the respect for rights of others, and it's self-interest and moral consistency.
Okay, even in the absence of some sort of governing authority.
Yes, because all of this, now on an island, you can argue about whether if there are 2 or 3 people on an island, the concept of rights even comes up. And I know some people who say it doesn't come up until you have a government and a larger society. I actually disagree with that, but I don't think a lot hangs on it. I think rights arise as soon as 2 conceptual beings are together and one of them, and they're trying to figure out how to work, and you have to say, look, force is out of the question here. And it's out of the question because to live, we have to act on our judgment. So, but again, nothing hangs on whether or not you decide that that's, whether you call that rights or whether you just say it's a fact, either way, it's a fact. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I wanted to offer a metaphor that I've been using and thinking about these issues a lot. And the reason why is because I think this is an area where the wording that we use is so sloppy and confusing that, the list of rights question, for instance, is a very common one. So the way I've come to think of it is that rights are slices of liberty. I have a liberty and a legitimate liberty to engage in, rights, a life-sustaining action and so forth. And the question arises with regard to whether I have a right to do something only when some other person proposes to engage in some activity that affects me. Like you said, only if 2 or more people are around. And it's when that person proposes to take some action with regard to me that you have this intersection of our liberties. And then the question arises of justifying that person's actions toward me. And as Rand's definition of rights suggests, by its use of the word sanction, rights are a justifying principle with regard to that person's actions towards me. This is why everybody seems to concede that you only have rights against human beings. Even animal rights people don't suggest that a tiger has a right valid against an antelope or vice versa, right? So the only reason is because rights act as a justifying principle when some other person proposes some action toward me that would affect my liberty. And it's the intersection of those 2 things that gives rise to the question of whether that slice there of my liberty is a legitimate one or not. And that leads to questions that we lawyers get into about whether or not this proposed right is justified under all the circumstances and so forth. But that, thinking about that way, that rights are slices of this abstract, indefinite field of liberty that I have, I think solves a lot of these list of rights questions. Because otherwise you get into this infinite regress. I have a right to wear a hat. I also have a right to wear a hat tomorrow. I also have a right to wear a hat tomorrow afternoon. And I also have a right not to have somebody take my hat off of my head. You get into these infinite regresses if you think of rights as these particular things. And rights are only particular things in the context of a particular dispute about the status of my liberty.
I think that's an excellent point, and what it does nicely, and I hadn't heard it put that way before, it points out the fact that there's a context in which we're talking about rights. There's a sphere. The sphere is we're talking about what people should be or should not be at liberty to do. You can either way, you can talk about freedom or liberty, and it just makes very clear that that's the context. So we're talking about aspects of human action and interaction within the framework of freedom versus non-freedom or liberty versus non-liberty. And that also helps to answer the earlier question about a tiger keeping me out of the cave. We're talking about a human social context and human interaction. That's where rights arise. Incidentally, just briefly, real quick, this conception of rights also makes very clear the issue of abortion rights, because the purpose of the concept of rights, both historically in the way that it has been developed and logically in regard to the reason that we need the concept, is all about a social context. And Rand gets it in Rand's definition. Is the rights are moral principles defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. And so we are in a social context here. A fetus is not in a social context. A fetus is inside of a woman. So that's not the whole argument, but it's a major aspect of the argument that I think have grasped and used, and I think it's worth, and anybody who gets into these discussions, it's worth doing. And this is not just an assertion. This is the way that the concept of rights was formed over time. And the reason that we need the concept is because we live in a social context and we're trying to answer the question, what should we people in this social context be at liberty to do or not to do? That's what it is. Now, if somebody wants to argue that fetuses have some kind of a moral prerogative, that's fine, but you can't call them rights, because that's not what this concept is.
On a hungry man is not free, could you comment on using ability as a distinction? So, for example, I'm free to play for the Boston Celtics, but I'm not able. Last time I checked, I'm not capable of playing. Right? So there's a distinction. And the reason I ask is in political philosophy, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, who were very influential, have a concept called capability as freedom. So when you say capability as freedom, they're defining freedom in just this way. You're not free unless you're able, with resources and stuff like that. So I'm just curious whether in arguing with people, if they say, well, what about the hungry man? You say he's free, but not able to. And so I just wonder if that's helpful.
Yeah, that is a good question. And it brings, I think, the integration that would make it easier to segue in with this. So Richard's question is, what about the argument that a person is not free if he's not able to do something? So a man might be down and out, and I say, well, look, he's free to take action. And he's not able to take action because he doesn't have knowledge, or he doesn't have access to the kinds of things that you do because he doesn't have money or whatever. And this sounds very similar to, and my guess is that the people who use that idea, this sounds very similar to the idea that of equality of opportunity versus equality before the law. And you know, there are three different ways you can think about equality, at least in this important respect. There's equality before the law. There's equality of opportunity. Everybody should have the same opportunities. And then there's equality of goods and services. Everybody should have the same goods and services. And some people in the liberty movement try to embrace this equality of opportunity aspect, but that's wrong. This is the essence of egalitarianism. Rawls does not talk about equality of goods and services. He talks explicitly about equality of opportunity. And that's their linchpin. Don't embrace that. People, it is not true that we have a right to equality of opportunity. There are many things I do not have an opportunity to do, and that I do not have a right to do because I don't have that opportunity. I don't have the opportunity to play for the Boston Celtics. I don't have the opportunity to buy a $10 million home. There's lots of things I don't have the opportunity to do. I have the opportunity to take actions to try to do those things. There's the actions. But I'm not entirely familiar with the arguments that you're bringing up, but I would say this of ability. You can equivocate on ability. Ability to use your mind to take actions towards some goal that you want is one thing. Ability to use goods and services that other people have produced so that you can achieve some end is another. And we all use goods and services that others have produced to achieve our ends, but we properly get those goods and services by voluntary trade. That way we're not violating their rights. So you have to be, I would say you just have to be really clear on that distinction.
Hello, Craig. Yesterday you mentioned Jordan Peterson a couple of times. At the end of the presentation this morning, you talked about the liberty movement not having the knowledge that we possess as objectivists. How do we as objectivists insert ourselves into the popular culture with the success of a Jordan Peterson or a Ben Shapiro?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So how do we objectivists or fans of rational philosophy and freedom and flourishing inject these ideas into the culture and achieve the kind of success that, say, a Jordan Peterson or a Ben Shapiro or a Sam Harris is getting with their ideas? Well, the main thing that we have to do is understand the ideas. And then the other thing that we have to do is share the ideas. So when objectivists or advocates of liberty who produce good material, share it. Get it out there. Go point out. Grab an article by Richard Salzman or Tim Sandefur and go post it somewhere if it applies to something that's going on. There's a lot of ridiculous infighting in the libertarian and the objectivist movement and the liberty movement. And it's retarded people from being rational about the values that we share and the need to share these things. And that is completely suffocating our ideas. They're not getting out there. So what I recommend is that if somebody has produced something good, whether a video or a book or an article or whatever, a podcast, and if it's good and you know it's good and you know that you can apply it somewhere, do it. The only way that objectivist speakers like me and others are going to get on to big main stages is if the people who like what we do help and support us to bring us into the limelight and to put us on these stages. How did Ben Shapiro get on the stage? Because his fans love him and they understand the conservatives support conservative ideas. Libertarians support libertarian ideas. The leftists support leftist ideas. Reason Magazine gets millions of dollars every year. National Review gets millions of dollars every year. Democracy Journal gets millions of dollars every year. Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, all these guys get millions of dollars of money given to them on either their Patreon accounts or their websites or whatever, or through their fundraising drives or their conferences or whatever. And we have a much smaller group. Objectivists and advocates of the kind of philosophy that we're talking about at this conference, we're a much smaller group. But we can support each other, and if we do, then we'll get more of the speakers and writers on the stage, and we will make mincemeat of the other ideas. I would love to get on a stage with Jordan Peterson, but I'm not going to get there unless people help. And I'd love to see Tim Sandefur or Richard Salzman or Andy Bernstein or Carrie Ann Biondi, any of these speakers at this conference on a stage with some of these other intellectuals. We have the facts on our side. We just need to cooperate, and the main cooperation is sharing. Share the stuff. Share it on social media. Share it on Facebook. If you're at a New York Times article and there's a commentary discussion going on, and there's some article that somebody wrote that's really good, pop it in there. And if they don't take links, just mention the name of it and say, search this thing. So be creative and share. And if we all work together, if we understand these ideas pretty well, and we all work together, to get them out there. And it's a division of labor. I mean, if you're a doctor or a lawyer or a restaurant owner or whatever, you're not putting your time into this stuff all the time. But some of us are, and if you can help us by sharing the stuff and giving financial support where and as possible, never sacrificially, but if you value this and can support it, the kinds of things that TOS does and other organizations, if you support us, we will make good. This is what we want to do. We just need the support. So I'm glad you asked that question. I'm happy to end on that note. Thank you all.